I'd like to welcome everybody to this evening's 2010 Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz Memorial Lectureship. The Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz Memorial Lectureship annually brings to the University of California at Berkeley a distinguished scholar, professional military person, or a government official for a series of lectures on specific national security subjects. It provides a better and fuller understanding and awareness of national security concerns in the light of the geopolitical balance, world economics, advanced technology, and other critical factors. The Fleet Admiral Nimitz Lectureship was established in 1983 to enhance the spirit and sense of community to the university through a multidisciplinary subject matter of national security affairs. An endowment has been set up through the support of the Friends of the University, the Friends of the Navy, and the general public to ensure continuation and growth of the Nimitz Lectureship, and to establish a tradition of commitment toward the study of the political, strategic problems of which our nation confronts in the contemporary world. I would like to say a few words about Admiral Nimitz before we get on, just so everybody understands about who the man is that we're contributing this lectureship to. Fleet Admiral Nimitz was born in Fredericksburg, Texas in February of 1885. It was here on the steps of his grandfather's hotel that young Chester Nimitz received his first impressions of the life at sea. He would sit for hours and listen with fascination to his grandfather's sea stories. Later, Admiral Nimitz would say of his grandfather, "I had a wonderful white-bearded grandfather. He was Charles Nimitz, who settled in Fredericksburg, Texas, and built a steamboat-shaped hotel." But while out on a training exercise with a field artillery unit, a young Army officer, Lieutenant William Cruikshank, stopped at the Nimitz Hotel. Nimitz was very impressed with Lieutenant Cruikshank's military bearing and uniform, and knew Cruikshank was not much more older than himself. This was the life that Nimitz wanted. But Nimitz was denied entry into West Point. For whatever reason, I have no idea, and I'm going to turn that over to the colonels up in front. I'm just kidding. Little humor there. Anyway, he was offered a appointment to the Naval Academy, in which he accepted, and was commissioned a ensign when he graduated. As his career unfolded, he held many prominent positions within the hierarchy of the Navy chain of command. He established himself as an expert in submarine propulsion, as an early advocate of diesel submarines. He built a submarine base at Pearl Harbor, and he founded one of the first Naval Reserve Officer Training Corps units, and that happened to be, in 1926, the University of California, Berkeley, NROTC, which was one of the very first of 6 Naval ROTC units that were established. He was very pivotal in the introduction of the carrier into the battle group, and he actually commanded the flagship in the Asiatic Fleet and was appointed commander of Battleship Division 1 during World War II. Along the way, though, he shifted his focus from engineering to personnel, and at the outbreak of World War II, he was actually the chief of naval personnel. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, instructions were sent from President Franklin Roosevelt to the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Cox, and he told him, "Tell Nimitz to get the hell to Pearl Harbor and stay there until the war is won." Nimitz assumed command of the Pacific Fleet on December 31st, 1941. From that day on, he carried the fight to the enemy. His superb leadership and the valor of more than 2 million American fighting men culminated on the deck of the USS Missouri 4 years later, after he signed the Japanese surrender as commander-in-chief of the largest armada ever assembled. On December 15th, 1945, Admiral Nimitz relieved Fleet Admiral Ernest King as Chief of Naval Operations. One of his final acts as CNO was the introduction of the Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program, laying the groundwork that led to the development of the Nimitz-class carrier in the United States Navy. He eventually came and retired at Berkeley, California, and was a regent of the University of California before he transferred over to Naval Station over at Treasure Island. Tonight, I am very pleased to announce that we have, for our speaker tonight, Mr. Nathanial Fick, who carries on a great heritage and a great history of what this Nimitz Lectureship is all about. Nathanial Fick was appointed as a Chief Executive Officer of the Center of the New American Security in June of 2009. He was previously the Chief Operating Officer of the New American Security and had been a fellow of the Center since its foundation in 2007. Prior to joining the American Security, he served as a Marine Corps infantry officer. He took part in the earliest phases of Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan and Pakistan in 2001 and 2002, and actually led a reconnaissance unit during the invasion of Iraq in 2003. He was a visiting fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and in 2007, he served as a civilian instructor at the Afghanistan Counterinsurgency Academy in Kabul. Mr. Fick actually spoke at the Denver's Invesco Field at the 2008 Democratic National Convention and later served on the President's transition team as part of the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs after that. But more prominently, he is the author of the New York Times bestselling book, One Bullet Away, in which he tonight will go ahead and talk about his experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq and how that has transformed him into what he is today and as a Chief Executive Officer of the agency that he's at. He right now also serves as on the board of the Marine Corps Scholarship Foundation, and he provides educational opportunities to the children of Marines that are actually killed in action in the Rockefeller Center of Public Diplomacy in Dartmouth College. He holds an AB degree with high honors in classics and government from Dartmouth, where he won a national championship title in cycling. So he's actually a very fit guy. So I won't try to fight him tonight. He received an MPA and an MBA from Harvard, and I would like to introduce Mr. Nathanial Fick as our 2010 Nimitz Lectureship speaker tonight. One round of applause, please.
Thanks a lot, Captain Laird, for the kind introduction, and thank you all for being here. It's a real honor for me to be here at Berkeley for two reasons, I guess, in particular. First, the invitation to be here with you came from the cadets and midshipmen in the ROTC program here, and that means a great deal to me because you all, who are easy to pick out in this crowd, are choosing to serve in uniform in a time of war. And you're joining a wartime military, making a much more difficult choice than I made serving in a peacetime military in the 1990s. I mentioned this last night, but I'll just say it again, that the other special tie for me is to Admiral Nimitz. My grandfather made the choice that many of you are choosing and joined the Navy in 1942, dropped out of Yale in order to go serve in the Pacific under Admiral Nimitz. And he was wounded in June of 1945 by a kamikaze that detonated into his ship. And the metal from the kamikaze aircraft was made into little horseshoes by the crew of the ship. And he gave it to me when I joined the Marines, and I wore it around my neck when I was in Afghanistan and Iraq. So it just feels to me like some strands are coming together here tonight. My pledge to you is that I'm going to keep my comments relatively brief. I'm not going to go more than 30 minutes and leave plenty of time for questions. And I guess I'll just say right up front that I've done this a couple of times. My skin gets a little bit thicker each time, so nothing's off limits. Fire away. And if I can't take it, then I'll just trust that I can outrun you. But I'm going to run through three parts of this talk. And this, by design, is very experiential talk. It's a personal talk based on one person's view of what happened and is happening in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And I'm not an academic, so I'm going to reason freely from anecdote. And that's my caveat right up front. I'm first going to talk a bit about training. I think it's important to understand the capabilities of these forces and maybe even more important, to understand their limitations. Then I'll talk a bit about Afghanistan and then finally a bit about Iraq. I'll be back tomorrow night to give another lecture, and that lecture is a bit more abstract, a little more academic, on the topic of civil-military relations and creating a framework for the civil-military relationship for the 21st century, recognizing that while civ-mil relations in the U.S. are not as bad as they once were, they're not as good as citizens deserve. So with that, I will delve into this. I was an infantry officer in the Marines, and so we can beat around the bush, but my job really boiled down to a fairly simple trio of things. Shoot, move, and communicate, kind of like a three-legged stool. And the shooting piece is fairly self-explanatory. The moving, I confess I was seduced by all of the recruiting commercial moving, the parachuting and the scuba diving and all that, and I got to do a little bit of it, but more often the moving for me was in a kind of dune buggy style Humvee, and I laughed, well, kind of ruefully laughed later when the debate over armor and armoring these vehicles was above the fold in the newspaper every day, because as you'll see, we not only didn't have armor, but didn't have doors, didn't have windshields. The times changed, and just as U.S. forces learned and adapted, our adversaries learned and adapted. And the third leg of that stool, though, communicating, this was really the most important part of my job. And at any given point on the ground in Iraq or Afghanistan, most of our men and women who are serving in the military have on them a rifle and a radio. And if you had given me the choice, I'd give you the rifle every time, but don't take away the radio. Take away the radio from a small unit that's moving on a big battlefield, and you put them in a very, very dangerous spot. So communications, that third leg of the stool, were really of paramount importance. And it wasn't just voice communication, but all sorts of other uses of information technology. So just to give you one example, this is a photograph of the approach to a cave complex in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan that one of my teams of Marines took sometime in the fall of 2001. And you see it's labeled there, approach close up, then the 6-digit grid where the photo was taken, the direction the camera was pointing, so that you could overlay it on a map and see exactly what you're looking at, from the team's name, Quizmaster 2, at 9:30 in the morning on whatever morning this was. And this is probably sometime in November of '01. And this photo would be beamed as an encrypted digital burst via satellite from the team on the ground, the guy with the camera, back to a raid force commander who's maybe planning a mission in Oman or in Bahrain or in Saudi Arabia or someplace fairly remote from eastern Afghanistan. And then that raid force commander has almost real-time imagery of what he, or in most cases he, is going to be up against maybe that night or the next night. So just a quick overview of those fundamentals. So I joined a peacetime military in the 1990s, and I was in Australia on September 11th training with the Australian Army to go into East Timor. And 8:30 in the morning on the east coast of the United States was 10:30 in the evening in Darwin, and we were sitting at a bar having a beer and watched the attacks unfold live on CNN behind the bar. And within a matter of hours, literally before sunrise the next morning, we were on our way to the North Arabian Sea and then into Pakistan and Afghanistan. I want you to remember this photo, please. This is emblematic of my experience in Afghanistan, a few kids running after a patrol in relatively open ground. And I'm going to contrast it with a photo in a few moments. So I would appreciate it if you just try to remember this one. When I talk now with cadets or midshipmen or junior officers who are about to head out on their first deployment, one of the questions they typically ask is what they should bring or how they can be ready. And my answer invariably is bring a good book. Because you're going to spend an awful lot of time flat on your back waiting for something to happen. And the old adage about war is that it's hours of boredom punctuated by seconds of sheer terror. And I think there's some truth to that. This is my unit in a barracks room at an air base in Pakistan, just waiting for something to happen, waiting for actionable intelligence. So information that was sufficiently timely and of sufficiently high quality to justify putting people in harm's way. And actionable intelligence, by its very nature, is perishable. So when it comes, you have to move quickly before it becomes obsolete. And so immediately you find yourself switching gears and going from, laying on your back reading a book to spinning up to go on a mission. And this photo was taken on, I'll never forget it, Friday night, October 19th, 2001. And this was one of the first missions into southern Afghanistan, a mission to capture an airfield and kill or capture Mullah Omar, the head of the Taliban. And it's kind of grainy green. It was taken through night vision goggles. And this mission, obviously, at the time was a classified mission. It was a secret mission because of the sensitivity of what we were trying to do. But remember now, this is a Friday night. It showed up, photos like this showed up on the front page of the Sunday New York Times 2 days later. And my mother cut out the article and mailed it to me with a note that said, "I sure am glad you weren't a part of this." And I figured she would rest easier if I didn't correct her. So you're constantly going through these emotional ups and downs because you come back from a mission like that, and then you're back to working out. This is not a Marine. You can tell from the hair. This is a Navy corpsman who worked with us. And he's lifting not weights, but MRE boxes, trying to stay fit over the course of this long deployment. And if I can maybe just tell one quick anecdote, he's standing in front of a hardened hangar, a reinforced concrete hangar at an air base in Pakistan. And if you remember, in the 1990s, the U.S. Made a deal to sell the Pakistanis F-16s. And then what did they do? They detonated a nuclear weapon. And we kept their money but didn't send them the jets. And so all over Pakistan, there are these fighter bases with these nice, fancy new hangars that are just the right size for an F-16. And I got a phone call one day and had to go into the Pakistani pilot's ready room to take the call. And as my eyes adjusted from the sunlight into this dark room, I saw a couple dozen Pakistani Air Force pilots lounging around in flight suits, smoking cigarettes. And the walls of the ready room looked like an 8-year-old's bedroom. They were covered in pictures of F-16s, but without a single F-16 in the country. So when we finally made it into Afghanistan for good, before November, we were in and out of Afghanistan, but we weren't there permanently. By the time we actually got there, the first thing you notice in Afghanistan is that terrain dominates everything. And Afghanistan's been described as a wall separating Central Asia from the Indian subcontinent. And that's true. If you're in Jalalabad in southeastern Afghanistan, believe it or not, there are palm trees. It looks like the subcontinent. And then as you climb west out of Jalalabad, you go up and up and up and up and up to the land where no palm trees grow. And military operations are dictated by this terrain. Not only moving on foot where, look at this. Moving on foot, you don't make it very far in the course of a day. Many places you can't use a vehicle. And even in many places, the mountains are so high that a good portion of our helicopter fleet can't fly there. There are only a few helicopters in the U.S. inventory that can fly in the high mountains of Afghanistan. It's also a stunningly beautiful place, disarmingly so. Not quite as disconcerting as fighting a war in Normandy, say, but surprisingly beautiful. And my photo doesn't really do this justice, but sunset in the Afghan desert is spectacular. And the air is so clear because there's no industry. There were places where you could count on two hands the number of internal combustion engines for 100 miles around. It's high and it's sparsely populated, and the air is so clear that on the first few nights we were there, we would think that we were seeing headlights on the horizon or campfires on the horizon, and it took us a while to realize that what we were actually seeing were stars rising. Even in the middle of the Pacific Ocean at night, I never saw a star pop across the horizon, but in the highlands of Afghanistan, you can. It is, however, a deceiving sense of beauty, and this is a sign that one of my jokers made. But like many young Marines and soldiers, he actually had a phenomenal amount of insight behind that kind of gruff and irreverent exterior, and he was right. We would roll into a village like this one and go through the elaborate rituals of that part of the world. And I, as the unit leader, would sit down with an elder, and inevitably a very regimented conversation would unfold, where out would come a carpet and a teapot, and the conversation typically went something like, "We're really glad the Americans are here, but you're lucky you didn't go into the village next door because it's full of Taliban." And we would finish our tea and stand up and go into the village next door, and out would come the carpet, and out would come the teapot, and the conversation would be, "We're really glad the Americans are here, and you're lucky you made it out of the last village alive because it's full of Taliban." And you quickly realize that it's a hall of mirrors, and it's very hard, nearly impossible, to read the political nuance in a place when you can't read the street signs. So how many Pashto speakers do we have in the room? Dari? Farsi? How about Arabic? There we go. Okay, a few. And that's my point. Good luck training 30-year-old Marine captains to speak Pashto. You might get a few basic formalities to demonstrate good faith, but this isn't a problem with the U.S. military, it's a problem with primary education in the United States. If we're going to do this, if we're going to teach languages, you got to start early. It's not something for the military academies and ROTC programs to tackle necessarily. It's part of a broader issue. So the high watermark really of my time in Afghanistan came then at the end of 2001 when we began getting intelligence, building an intelligence picture, approaching the level of having actionable intelligence that I referred to earlier, that put possibly Osama bin Laden, but certainly his number two, Dr. Zawahiri, a handful of their other commanders and many of their fighters at a place called Tora Bora. And I actually told this story to some of my sister's college classmates when I got back, and one of them said, "Yeah, I think my brother went on his honeymoon there." And no, not Bora Bora, but Tora Bora, which is a cave complex in the high mountains of eastern Afghanistan, built by Al-Qaeda, before it was really Al-Qaeda, but built by many of the same people when they were fighting the Soviets as kind of the final redoubt to fall back on and fight from in the mountains of the east. And this photograph is a photo of bin Laden's farm, which was not at Tora Bora, but was nearby. And after the destruction of the farm, the picture began to build to put bin Laden at Tora Bora. And we spun up for the mission to go up there and surround this cave complex and capture these guys. And at the last minute, the mission was scrubbed, and instead of sending Americans to do it, Afghans did it instead. And this didn't get much attention for about 7 or 8 years, and then only recently it did. And the Senate Foreign Relations Committee just released a report about this whole chain of events. And unfortunately, what happened is the Afghans did not really seal off Tora Bora. Some camel trading took place, and Al-Qaeda senior leadership escaped across the border into Pakistan. And this was the week before Christmas of 2001, and it's a time that I will never forget because I think it was in many ways our last best chance to get these people in one place. And they dispersed, and the ideology has further metastasized. And so just as we've learned, they've learned, and they'll never be in one place together like they were the week before Christmas of 2001. So I came back to the States then in mid-2002, and almost immediately began training to go back, this time to the Middle East, to Kuwait, to wait for the Iraq War to start. And I asked you earlier to remember that photograph from Afghanistan and contrast it, please, with this photograph from Iraq. And I think you'll see the kind of inherent difference between the two. This is a hard place to fight a war. And this is a battlefield where the civilians are intrinsically a part of what's going on, and that became a dominant and enduring theme in the war in Iraq for years after I left. So in the very beginning, it was a conventional invasion. The photographs look a lot like photos of the first Gulf War in 1991, where we were driving up a highway, and the reception we got was almost uniform. The soldiers we ran into surrendered, and in most cases they surrendered in return for one of those yellow bags, which is a humanitarian ration, just food. And interestingly, I think this photo was taken at a Republican Guard artillery battery that we overran. And I had a conversation with the Western-educated colonel who commanded this artillery unit, and he spoke fluent English. And I noticed that all of his men had gas masks, and they had atropine injectors, which is a nerve agent antidote. And I asked him if he thought that the Americans were going to use chemical weapons against him. And he said, no, I thought Saddam was going to use them against you, and we would be caught in the crossfire, which was interesting. And obviously, as it turned out, there were none, but there had been a very sophisticated disinformation campaign where every Iraqi commander, or many of the Iraqi commanders, knew that they themselves didn't have any WMD, but they were pretty convinced that the guy to their left and the guy to their right did. And they all had an inferiority complex. Why was I not trusted enough to have them? And so it was kind of a, it was a control issue. And from what I saw, it was pretty effective in convincing these guys that they were under suspicion and therefore better be on their best behavior. So the first inkling for us, really, that maybe there would be some real resistance came in a town called Nasiriyah, where there's a key bridge over the Euphrates River. And do you remember Private Jessica Lynch, the Army private who was captured and thrown in jail? That Humvee there that's crashed into the back of that truck is the Humvee that Private Lynch was riding in. And a Marine unit went into Nasiriyah to try to rescue this convoy that got in trouble and got tangled up in a big fight. And my next photo is a little graphic, so I'll just warn you. And I don't show it for any prurient reason, but this is a dead Iraqi fighter in Nasiriyah. And I show it to you because if you want to understand this kind of war, you really do need to see a picture of a guy in a flannel shirt holding a machine gun, because this is not my grandfather's war. This is a different kind of fight, and a fight where the adversary learned a lesson. Sorry, this is the problem when you put an infantry officer in charge of anything even remotely technological. There we go. So the adversary did exactly what you would expect him to do. Retreat into the civilian population and fight from there. And I like this photo. This is, you wonder what happens when you give your clothes to Goodwill. This is part of what happens. They end up in places like Iraq. And so I'm willing to bet that this kid had no idea who Beavis and Butthead are, but he was proudly wearing the shirt. And so that was really the great lesson of the Gulf War in 1991, summed up by an Indian Army general here. Don't fight the U.S. unless you have a nuclear arsenal. And our dominance of the conventional part of the spectrum drove our adversaries to the poles. So you saw in Iraq and in Afghanistan, they went to the left there, down to insurgency and irregular warfare. And in other places, think North Korea, think Iran, they went to the right. And so it's pretty unlikely that we're going to have tank-on-tank conventional warfare again in the foreseeable future, because the great and enduring lesson of 1991 was if you do that, you die. So there has to be another way. And in a way, this is kind of the return of history. And so go back to Lawrence at the end of, in the latter stages of World War I, and he said that, well, you can read the quote, and the imagery is pretty effective, and that's a lot what it's like. So how do you combat that? How do you deal with that? Our first instinct that proved to be partly right, but ultimately not enough, was technology. And so even at the small unit level, you had the proliferation of very sophisticated technology. This little remote-controlled airplane-looking thing is a small UAV, an unmanned aerial vehicle, and on board it has a camera and a GPS, and it's linked to a laptop there, and you can fly it And because it has a GPS on board, it knows what it's looking at, or knows where it's looking. And so it'll beam coordinates back, and you can get on the radio and call a jet overhead. And in one case, we flew this thing up the highway, and there was an armored vehicle coming down toward us, their armored vehicle, not ours. And we radioed the coordinates up to the jet. The jet dropped a bomb, blew it up, and we were over the next hill 3 kilometers away, which is exactly the way that I would prefer to fight an armored vehicle. Other technology too, this little computer screen is something called the Blue Force Tracker. So every vehicle of ours had a transponder on it, and these computers are loaded with scrolling maps. So imagine a map that's moving as you move, like the GPS in your car, but on it is a dot representing all the other cars that are with you. And you can click on any one of them and send a text message and communicate with one another and see where everybody else is. And so the net effect here is you're pushing awareness down to a very low level. And whereas only a few years ago, only a senior commander in a headquarters would have that kind of situational awareness. Now, a lowly small unit commander like me had that kind of battle space awareness, which is pretty remarkable. But the fix isn't technological. It has to be something else. And I'll just try to illustrate that with a pair of anecdotes here that were part of my learning curve. So we were driving through a small village northeast of Baghdad one day, and somebody fired a rocket-propelled grenade at us from somewhere back in these buildings. And we did what was tactically justified and dismounted from our vehicles and swept through the village and tried to find the shooter, who of course had long since disappeared into the palm grove back behind the village. But we did succeed in cornering some very terrified women and kids in a house and rounding up a few of the men and putting them face down in the dirt and interrogating them to see who had fired the rocket. And as we drove away, not having found the shooter, I found myself reflecting on whether we had done, whether this was a net positive or a net negative for us, whether we had done more harm or more good. And I concluded, in my mind, at that point, although I didn't have a better answer, that we had done more harm. And so a couple of weeks went by, and this time we were walking on foot in a nearby village, and there was an air of hostility that I hadn't detected before. And I asked through an interpreter, one of these Iraqi gentlemen on the street, what was going on, and he said, "It's your sunglasses." And everybody was wearing these wraparound glasses. And I said, "What about them?" Thinking that it was an issue of respect, that they wanted to see our eyes. And he said, "We think those are X-ray glasses and you're looking at our women." So, not the answer I expected. I took my glasses off and I put them on this guy, and you know what he said to me? "Turn them on." So we all took our glasses off and we put them on these kids who were following us around. And the kids followed us for the rest of the day wearing the sunglasses, and we stayed in this particular town for a little while. And what we found is that people began to give us information. They began to tell us when something was amiss, tell us when there were strangers in town. And the lesson that I learned was that when you listen to people's concerns, no matter how irrational they may sound, you can actually begin to build a little bit of goodwill. And if I extrapolate that out and I replicate this 10,000 times over a few years, and then I replicate this 10,000 times over a few years, I think they actually take us to very different places. And so these tactical actions have a strategic impact over time and replicated in many different places. So the trick is, how do you get a big institution to learn? And I think that the U.S. military has actually done a pretty remarkable job at the tactical and operational level of learning. And these are not, this is not an unusual list of characteristics. It's true of any company or class, university perhaps. And so now we have to balance between learning and adapting to these different wars that we were unprepared for in 2001 and in 2003, but also maintaining the capabilities that we need to do all sorts of different things. We don't have the luxury of one future, and so you have to prepare for many different futures, and that requires some harsh budgetary trade-offs in particular, and that's something I'll talk a little bit more about tomorrow night. But learn the military did, and arguably maybe not fast enough, and certainly there were and continue to be disconnects between the strategic and policy levels and the tactical and operational levels. But I went back to Afghanistan many times to teach at the Counterinsurgency Academy in Kabul, and you see this kind of motley crew here of American officers and NATO officers and Afghan army and police officers and some civilians. And this process of shortening the feedback loop and of disseminating the lessons that were learned actually helped, I think, the military to change course much more quickly than many would have guessed back in 2001. So I'm going to wrap up here so that we have time for some questions, just with a quote from Secretary Gates about what the future may look like in his view. And then, so we don't end on a total downer, I'll just share 3 photographs from Afghanistan that I really like that kind of destroy some stereotypes. So this is a coffee shop in Kabul, believe it or not. Note the flat screen televisions on the glass elevators, and the people hanging out wearing jeans and shirts, sipping their lattes. It doesn't look like my mental image of Kabul, but I took the picture, and I promise you that's Kabul. This, too, is Afghanistan. This is in Nangarhar province in the east, in a city called Jalalabad. I was driving through one night and saw this glow on the horizon, and it was like driving into Vegas through the desert at night. And I had to pull over and take a picture. It's a wedding hall. And again, kind of belies the stereotypes about Afghanistan. And now, just my parting shot here before we go to questions for a few minutes is, of all the many pictures I took on these subsequent trips back, this is undoubtedly my favorite. And what it says to me is that at some deep level, there's a great commonality among all of us. And yeah, we have different ideologies, and some of us are motivated by different things, but there is some broad common thread among humanity that we tend to want better lives for our children than we had ourselves. We tend to want a roof over our heads, fresh water to drink, food to eat, access to health care, access to a job that gives us some hope that tomorrow will be better than yesterday. And so I think that if we can harness some of these common themes, the future is maybe not as futile as it sometimes seems when all we do is talk about the bombings and the attacks. So anyway, with that, I'll conclude, and I think we have at least a good 15 minutes or so for questions, and I welcome your comments, and thank you again for having me. Or I'll keep talking.
Yeah, thank you. Who allowed the Afghanis to take over the Tora Bora action?
Yeah, the question, who allowed the Afghans to take over the Tora Bora action? I can tell you my perspective and what I heard at the time. And what I heard at the time was actually backed up in this Senate Foreign Relations Committee report that you can actually download online and read. And I'm sure if you Google Foreign Relations Committee Tora Bora, you're probably not going to get that many hits. And it's worth reading. It's short. It reads like an adventure story. It's maybe 20 pages long. My understanding at the time was that, and this is, I was in the room with a one-star general when he got the word that the mission had been scrubbed. And he was told and echoed to us that it was canceled above CENTCOM's head. So if you know the military chain of command, above there ain't a lot above CENTCOM said. So the operational theaters are broken into these combatant commands, and the combatant commander reports to the Secretary of Defense, who reports to the President of the United States. So it was canceled in Washington, not in Afghanistan or in the theater. And we were told that it was canceled for fear of American casualties. This was, that's kind of hard to believe now, but we're in a different place now than we were then. So back in the fall of '01, you're still talking about maybe a dozen combat casualties total. It was wintertime. Tora Bora is at high altitude. The snow was deep. The weather was cold. We were outfitted to go to Iraq, not to go to Afghanistan. So many of the troops on the ground didn't have the cold weather gear yet that they needed or would have preferred to have fighting at high altitude. So, I can kind of get there in my head and see how they were thinking, but I still think it was a mistake. And, many of the guys on the ground are on the record that day as saying, hey, this is a mistake. We expected there would be casualties in that kind of operation. We may have been among them, and yet I think that the general consensus was that the risk, that the benefit was worth the risk.
All right. Good evening, sir. Lieutenant Reisinger. You talked about how, as an infantry officer, you were expected to go to homes of old men and have tea with them and tea with the local villagers. That's largely a counterinsurgency strategy. So how has the coin operations in Afghanistan been successful, and what are the disadvantages and advantages of the coin strategy versus conventional warfare?
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you. The counterinsurgency theory, first of all, it's not new. It's been revived. These lessons were learned at great cost before. They were learned in Vietnam. They were learned in World War I. They were learned in Malaya in the 1950s. They've been learned and relearned, and learned and forgotten and relearned and forgotten at high cost. There's been sort of the development of a counterinsurgency cult in the U.S. military, led in many ways by my business partner, an Army colonel named John Noggle. And I'm not fully a member of that cult. I think that they did something good in migrating an idea from kind of the fringe to the intellectual center, and accelerated the change that was necessary in the U.S. military. But I am of the school that just because that's what it looks like today does not mean that that's what it's going to look like tomorrow. Maybe not even in Afghanistan and Iraq, let alone the other places that we could be engaged. So, I think that we need to be careful about not putting all our eggs in one basket, and yet we still have a strategic and, I think, moral obligation, as long as we're going to have people engaged on the ground, to focus on winning the wars we're in. So that's just kind of my context disclaimer. That said, I think that the basic tenets of counterinsurgency are correct. The idea that our fundamental duty is to, one of our fundamental duties is to protect the population, because look at the greatest insurgent of the 20th century, Chairman Mao. Mao said that insurgents swim among the people like fish in the sea. And so if you have 1% of the population or 2% of the population as active insurgents, if they have the passive support of the other 98 or 99%, you, the counterinsurgent, are going to lose. And this is different from Vietnam, in my view, because the average Afghan who I spoke with over a course of 6 years in probably 25 of the 30-some provinces in the country, they lived under Taliban rule and they don't want it back. They like listening to music and flying kites and having their daughters have the option of going to school. Not everywhere, but in most places. And so the trick for the counterinsurgent is to convince those people that they should no longer straddle the fence, because as long as they're uncertain about the outcome and they don't know who's going to win, then they're going to make the rational choice to support both sides a little bit. And they're going to ride the fence and wait until they see who's likely to win. If the U.S. leaves, then they want to be rah-rah Taliban supporters. And if the U.S. is going to stay, then they want to support us. And so one of the tenets of counterinsurgency is protecting the people. And that sort of persistent presence of living among the people and staying among the people is critically important. You can't go back to your forward operating base at night and expect to persuade people that you have any staying power. Now, there's still a kinetic component here. You're not going to convince everyone, there is a necessary piece of this that involves going out and actively targeting the people you're fighting against. But if you're going to kill one enemy commander each night, and you're also, in the course of that operation, going to kill one innocent civilian, I would argue that you're doing more harm than good, and that your targeting has to be so good and so precise. I mean, it sets the bar for action incredibly high, and we jump more than we clear the bar, and so I think that some of the recent restrictions on, say, nighttime targeting, the guidance that the Marines were given in the Marja offensive recently to move very slowly. I mean, a pace that is probably driving those squad leaders and platoon leaders and company commanders crazy, because it's exposing them to a lot more risk. But sorry guys, winning the battle is part of it, but it's more important to win the war. And so they're going to have to bear a burden that's heavier than they would otherwise.
In your account of infantry school, you mentioned that Dr. Giovanni, or Dr. Death, the psychiatrist, offers 4 fundamentals on how to avoid psychiatric problems. And one of them that I found was a little bit strange and also curious was the critique. And I'm wondering how often during your missions you were able to sit down with your men and have a critique. And I have one more question too, if you have time. What is your perspective on women in infantry?
Okay. The critique. One of the things the military does best, in my experience, is rehearse before acting and then debrief afterwards. And I tell you what, I'm running a little civilian organization now, and we would be a lot better if that were a part of our culture too. And that act of actively rehearsing what it is you're about to do, whenever you have the time to do it, and then setting aside the time to actively think about and reflect on what you've just done, and have kind of a no-holds-barred critique is central if your organization is going to learn. You got to do it. If we don't set aside time in our lives to reflect and think, we're just going to keep doing what we're doing. And so as unlikely as it sounds, even in combat, 9 times out of 10, I saw that happen. I saw units take a pause, debrief, and then keep going. Now, it's not always immediately afterward, right? Maybe it's the next day or the next week even, but there's a culture that values that pause. You it's almost like your rank goes away too. It's pause, okay, unvarnished, what do we do right, what do we do wrong? Let's fix what we did wrong, reinforce what we did right, and do better next time. From a process standpoint, it's pretty impressive, and I didn't really appreciate it at the time, and it's only in hindsight that I've grown to truly appreciate it. And your second question, women in the infantry, it's, the notion that women are not serving in combat right now simply because there's a law that says they can't is absurd. It's like, there's a law that says we can't speed either, but it's, women are serving in combat. And I was telling someone last night, a group of the cadets and midshipmen, that my unit, we had I'm standing here tonight because of a female Air Force pilot who dropped the bomb when we needed a bomb dropped, and I didn't care what the voice on the other side of the radio sounded like. I just wanted that bomb, and I wanted it right now, and she did it. So, I think that, and I guess it's not an issue for me. The women in combat, I care about competence and performance, and I don't care about gender. Now, when you start talking about, there are gradations here, right? So you talk about women in submarines, where you have close quarters and some of the logistical challenges there. The Chief of Naval Operations is now saying that he thinks women should be aboard subs, and they'll make whatever modifications are necessary to do that. You talk about women in the infantry, small units, small combat units. It's alien to my experience, and I didn't live it, and I have a hard time envisioning it, but I suspect that that's the direction we're going. And the military has a code, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, that is the code of conduct, the legal code, actually, by which military members to which they're held accountable. And the purpose is to ensure good order and discipline in a unit. So units have to be combat effective. And if there's a interpersonal relationship or anything else that's undermining good order and discipline, it has to be dealt with. Male, female, homosexual, heterosexual, it doesn't really matter. So, I think the trend is that women are going to be serving in more and more units. The infantry is probably going to be the last to go. And I would suspect that we're not close to that point. But I think we're way past the point of having the women in combat discussion. That's been overtaken by events.
Beautiful story and pictures. I wondered if you could say a word about your interpreters. They always seem to occupy a difficult position in this conflict, and maybe I'd like to hear about how you used yours and what they were like.
Sure. The interpreters in many ways are kind of the unsung heroes, because they expose themselves to great personal risk. The physical risk, obviously, of retribution against them and against their families, but they also lost not just their physical lives, but they lost their lives. They weren't part of their community anymore. They had crossed over. And in many cases, I think it was impossible for them ever to go home again. You could see the precariousness of their position because, often they wouldn't always stay with us early on. They would stay in their homes at night, and we would pick them up on street corners far away from where they lived. And they'd be, we had one guy in particular who he'd be hiding in a doorway, and we would drive by, and he would run out and jump in, and he would be wearing a ski mask because of the risk that they exposed themselves to by being with us. And, I had other experiences with them as well. We had one interpreter in my unit in Iraq named Mish, and Mish had been in import-export in Kuwait before the war, and was kind of a shady character. And his brother had been killed by the Iraqis during the invasion of Kuwait in 1990. And it took me a while to figure this out, but Mish's sole goal in life was just to kill Iraqis. And that put us in a really hard position because it took a while to figure out what his motivations were. But we would walk up to somebody, a guy in a field, Mish and I, and I would say, "Hey, Mish, ask him what's going on," and the guy would be shaking his fist and spitting in the dirt, and Mish would say, "Captain, he says he's glad you're here and he's grateful to be liberated." And you got to read between the lines. So it was sometimes tricky, but by and large, the interpreters are what made all of this possible, because none of us could speak the language. And I didn't appreciate viscerally how disorienting that is and how impossible it actually makes it to do anything other than blow up enemy tanks if you can't speak the language. If you're going to have any kind of nuance, any sort of personal interaction, do anything at all by way of reassuring people or providing development or basic services, you have to be able to speak the language. And I wasn't going to learn to speak Arabic quickly enough, and so we relied on the interpreters. And I think we as a nation did a poor job of mobilizing our domestic Arabic-speaking or Pashto-speaking population. I have a good friend from graduate school who grew up in Afghanistan, and she volunteered after 9/11 to go back as an interpreter, and her husband did too, and they had both grown up in Kandahar, and their only request was that they could be with different units, sure, but they wanted to be put in the same part of the country so that they could at least occasionally see one another. And she got assigned to a unit in Farah province in far western Afghanistan, and he got assigned to a unit in Nangarhar in the east. And they were like, screw this. And so now they work at a consulting firm in Boston because the bureaucracy wasn't willing to honor their very reasonable request. And so we lost out on having them. And I would have trusted them a lot more than I would have trusted Mish. So the interpreters were in a tough spot, but they were in many ways the enabler that made any of the good operations that went well. Typically it was because there was a good interpreter helping guide things. And there are some charities now and other organizations that are dedicated to helping interpreters relocate to the U.S. But it's case by case, but by and large, unfortunately, I would say that we failed them.
Could you tell us more about the Center for New American Security tonight?
Sure. CNAS is a nonpartisan, nonprofit national security and defense policy think tank. It was started in 2007 by two people, a woman named Michelle Flournoy and a gentleman named Kurt Campbell. Michelle is now the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, the senior policy advisor to Secretary Gates, and Kurt is the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, so our senior, one of our senior diplomats working in Asia. And they started it to carve out the kind of non-ideological middle in national security and defense policy, so it's bipartisan. We have a relationship with the Pentagon where 5 active duty officers come and spend a year with us instead of going to the National War College, and they get credit for that. We're about 40 people total, and when Kurt and Michelle went into government last year, they asked John Noggle and I to take over, and so we are now trying to be a learning organization and to learn fast enough to adapt so that we're working on the issues that are going to be in the news next year or 10 years from now. We're doing a lot of work on cybersecurity, a lot of work on the emerging U.S. relationship with India, a lot of work with the Democratic Party of Japan, and they're helping them correct their early missteps that kind of inadvertently derailed the U.S.-Japan alliance. And we're doing a ton of work on the intersection of energy and natural resources with national security. And I think this might be my cue. All right. Go ahead, guys. You pick them.
Sir Mchibunawiki, you've spoken before that there's about a 3-month period between when Saddam's uniformed forces fell and his statue fell and then the insurgency started, and that was a window of opportunity that we missed. What do you think we could have done during that period, sir, that would have changed the outcome of the insurgency? Yeah,
Thank you. It's a good question, and I don't say that only because I've answered it before and know where to go with it. Little timeline quickly. So April of 2003, that statue was pulled down in Firdos Square in Baghdad. May of 2003, mid-May, I had the opportunity to, we'd been operating at a very fast tempo for a long time. And all of a sudden, in mid-May, for the first time, my unit got a day off. And we had all been going so fast for so long that we weren't just going to lay around. So I looked at the map and realized we were not too far from the ancient city of Babylon. And I asked the guys if they wanted to go tour the ancient ruins. And unanimously they said yes. And so we drove 60 or 70 miles across Iraq. We stopped at the kind of equivalent of a 7-Eleven and bought sodas. We did not even have rounds loaded in our weapons. So this is May of 2003. 6 months later, I would have been criminally negligent to take them on a trip like that. But in May of 2003, you could do it. And so statue came down in April. We went on our little field trip in May. Fast forward to August of 2003. That's when the Jordanian embassy in Baghdad was bombed. It's when the UN headquarters was blown up and Sergio de Mello, the UN representative, was killed. And that is the first time that I heard people talking about an insurgency. So April to August, at least 4 months, where we had an opportunity where my sense, in the sense of many others who've now written and spoken about it, sense is that there were a lot of people at that point who were riding the fence. They were waiting to see what was going to happen next. And if what happened next had been security for the population centers, if it had been the restoration of basic services, of electricity and access to water, and hospitals that were open and well-stocked, and the opportunity for jobs, if that had been what happened, then my argument is that the insurgency probably would have been a lot smaller and would have been a lot less vehement in its opposition. Instead, what we got was widespread looting. We got the dissolution of the Iraqi army, which turned hundreds of thousands of armed young men out into the street who now had no vested interest in stability. They had a vested interest in a Mad Max free-for-all, which is what it became. And so then we started down the slippery slope of sectarian warfare. And so I don't think the insurgency was foreordained. I don't think it had to be the way it was. And we did have a period of time in April, May, June, July of 2003 when Iraq was not a terribly violent place. Is that, boy, I'm sorry to end on that note, but listen, I'm happy to talk offline with anybody, and it's been a real pleasure being here. Thank you for having me.
I think that very few people in the country and this audience can argue with the fact that Mr. Fick points out that the environment that we find ourselves in, the country, and the geopolitical context is we have to continue to fight the asymmetrical war and continue down a counterinsurgency. But what that really means to us is we really have to get to the hearts and souls of these people that we're trying to help. And he makes a very good point tonight, and I'd like to point that out to the midshipmen and the cadets tonight, because it's very imperative that they figure this out before they get out there on a battlefield. And this point is that what we do on the tactical level can have over time major impact on the strategic level. That's a very important concept to understand, and I don't know if some of you will grasp it quite yet, but you'll catch on to it later. But what it really gets down to is we have to capture the hearts and souls of the people we're trying to help. If we don't do that, we are absolutely not going to win. We have to stand up, we have to be just in our warfare, and we have to be ethical in our warfare. And that's the point that he's trying to make. And I appreciate the fact that he came out here and chatted to us about this. But what I'd like to really thank him for is not his enlightful presentation, but the fact that he was on the ground in Afghanistan and Iraq and did what our country demanded of him for 5 years. And I'd like to give him a round of applause for that. Thank you very much. I hope that everybody can join us over at the Faculty Club for a reception after this. And of course, Mr. Fick will be over there to answer any of your other questions that he wasn't able to do that. So thank you for your time, and I appreciate you showing up tonight, and we'll see you over at the Faculty Club. Thank you very much.